All right, so this is the September 2023 part one of IEPs from the Parent Coalition of the Arc of Whatcom County. And welcome everybody. We're going to spend some time going over some of the advocacy basics and in IEP basics of how to even get working with the school district about that individual education plan. And I do like to start with just the piece about how our advocacy works for us as parents and as young people, your family members, as students, as they learn more about themselves. We really start with education, educating ourselves about a condition, a diagnosis, about how the school system works, so that we can better navigate that system. And once we know more about those things about our child and what's happening with insurance or children's hospital or an IEP team, then in learning how to navigate through that, we become better advocates. And as we're in those systems doing that advocacy, there are times we turn around that we want to change the policy, that we want to improve things and legislate as well. So that box that's kind of a circle is a helpful way to think about the steps that you as a parent continue to take in learning more about new systems, new teachers, new curriculum, anything else that's coming up in you and your family members' life. One of the other advocacy basics that I learned very early on is just a simple statement that if something's not written down, it didn't happen, that there's no proof that a principal or the janitor or a lunch lady or a teacher promised something or said something. And so it can be a lot of work and exhausting as a parent to do things. I think there are times where we want to write something down, to document a conversation, to jot down a note about a phone call, and to create a paper trail. And that might even be as simple as walking over to a wall calendar and on today's date, writing 3:30 p.m. Phone call from bus driver. And then you're keeping track of who's contacted you, what things are coming up in conversations, because that helps to build your story, and your advocacy journey is informed more by that to then educate others about what your experience is and what your child's experience is. But you don't have to write everything down. I don't still. It's a lot. So when we look at individual education plans and we talk about special education, there are state and federal laws about this. And well after the Americans with Disability Act was signed into law, Congress began working on special education law. And one of the statements in the federal law that I really appreciate is a statement that disability is a natural part of human diversity. We all think differently. We have different brains. We have different thought processes. We have different creativity and skills within those. I don't know how I have such a wonderful artist in my family, because my handwriting is really messy. And I don't know how one of my kids can do such beautiful work. So our diversity includes disability. Our diversity as humanity includes the different skills that each of us have, and that is natural, that is not something particularly that a student needs to overcome their disability in order to be in the classroom. And that's really where the special education law goes into detail about what a student's rights are to access education. So originally, if your child was not a part of an early intervention program and having early intervention or early learning in some way, the process and the structure that the states all have for identifying children with disabilities is called Child Find. And so if you've not entered from a birth to 3 program and had some sort of early identification, this is where a family would be able to work with the school district for something called Child Find. And Child Find can happen up to the age of 21. So it is federally and state mandated that a school district should be able to have an evaluation process for a student. So that first piece of Child Find can also be called a focus of concern, and making your child, that student, a focus of concern. So that would be in line with the piece of, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. We want to do something in writing. We want to put something in writing to access Child Find or to request an evaluation from the school. So there are some model forms from the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, and I have the link on the bottom of the page here. We'll send this to you, and in fact, this entire presentation, we can email it to you so that you have these links and this information, and you don't have to try to write down you know, the web address. The model forms include some information on how to request that evaluation, and that you can actually do that just by asking the school district. But what that would mean then is if the school district turned you down, you have no proof. If they just said, hey, forget it, no, we're not going to do an evaluation, there's nothing that you've built up in terms of that paper trail. So I really recommend making the request in writing. And you don't have to write a short story or to share too much information about your child. That's where some of the forms can come in handy and be really helpful, because they can ask some particular areas of need, of areas that you would want your child to be evaluated in. So once you put it in writing, the school district has to have an evaluation team that they would look at, and they would need to assess that student in all of the areas that are related to a suspected disability. And it might even be that it's actually a diagnosed disability, that you already have a diagnosis for your child, but the school's not done any sort of evaluation yet. That can happen with a child who's has ADHD, and maybe their behavior hadn't been that outstanding until age 5, and then they get into the kindergarten classroom, and some of that impulsivity and hyperactivity starts to show itself. They might have had the diagnosis before, and now we're starting to see the discrepancy between that student and other students. And that's, you know, we had the disability, but now we really need to look and see, how is the disability impacting their learning and their participation in class. So all of the results that come from the evaluation are used to determine whether or not the student is eligible for special education services and for other related services that may go along in connection with that disability. For instance, someone could need some occupational therapy or physical therapy, and that's not specially designed instruction, but it is related to that child learning and being involved and participating in the classroom. So that would be a related service, not necessarily specially designed instruction. So the team at the school does need to make a decision to evaluate. They may say that they don't want to evaluate. That could feel uncomfortable, but there's some ways, again, because we're putting it in writing, to be able to come back to that team and ask further. So the team then will look at and really look at 3 primary questions. Does this student have a disability? And does that disability adversely impact their education? And if so, then do they need specially designed instruction, or what is called SDI? And that's a piece that I find is really easy to think about. Many students are going to go to a classroom and they've heard some instruction and they've watched their peers learn how to hang up the backpack and put the coat over here and find where the pens are, or follow along to the library or something like that. Specially designed instruction is when our kids aren't necessarily picking up those cues in some way and learning vicariously and learning directly in that way. And that means we need to find another way to give that information to the student, that they're not getting it in the general manner. And so that's really the three areas that the evaluation team is going to look at. And this is helpful, again, later on, if you feel that there are areas that weren't covered by the evaluation team, is another way to be able to come back and delve into that a little bit more for that student. So hopefully, in all of that process, the child has been found to be eligible for special education and for related services. And once the team has said, yes, they're good, they have 30 calendar days to actually write an individual education plan for the child. So there's a real strong timeline about this and expectations that the school district would see, yes, we know that this child needs related services and special education, specially designed instruction, and we're going to need to get that to that student within, as it says, 30 calendar days. They don't have months to wait to be able to do this. They need to meet together and create an IEP with you, with parent, in order to meet that child's needs. There are quite a few categories of eligibility for special education. And each of these categories has different funding and actually different services within it that related to that eligibility category. There are services for folks who are deaf-blind that could be with orientation and mobility because somebody is not able to see well and they need training and support and instruction in navigating a building. There are students who may have some kind of health impairment that is impacting their ability to participate in physical education classes or do some things at recess. And so that health impairment in some way could include support for the student to be able to do those things with other students in PE and at recess. And one category here, developmental delay. This is a category that exists up until the age of 9 and through the age of 9. And part of that is because all children can have differences in their development. And so we do see developmental delays in a lot of children. And we give kids time to learn and grow and have some more time in the school and with families, in the hope that, and the expectation that some of them will be able to achieve some skills and move out of that category of developmental delay. But then there are some students who continue to show delays and would then be placed in another category after the age of 9. It could be something like multiple disabilities, or it could be autism, or some other kind of disability. So the developmental delay is just a category for younger children that doesn't necessarily have to follow them for their entire school career as well. And this is where I think one of the most important pieces comes up about writing the IEP. And that is the IEP team gets together to talk about the child's needs. So everything that you've learned through the evaluation and everything that you may have told the school district beforehand, we want to make sure that they document that within the individual education plan. We have to give consent as parents for the services to be provided. And the best way to give consent too is participating in that IEP meeting and helping to ensure that information about your child is really clearly laid out in the IEP. So one of the parts of the IEP that I think is the most important is what's called the present levels of educational performance and the present levels of functional performance, or some people call them PLOPs. They used to be called PLOPs. This is where you want to ensure that if a need hasn't been described or defined in some way by the IEP team, that at that meeting, we ask to have further information added. Because when the school decides and understands that a student has a need, that we need to meet that need then, and it is the obligation of the school district to meet that need. If a student needs an FM system in order to be able to hear a teacher, and so they've got headphones and the teacher is wearing some sort of microphone, and the student needs to sit up closer to the front in order to see things on the board, if we haven't written down some of those child's needs, then there isn't an expectation that the school is going to meet those. And I'm not sure actually that I gave the best example about that, because an FM system isn't necessarily something you'd need for special education. It could just be an accommodation, but it is absolutely something to share about what those students' needs are. And that's really, I think, the most powerful part of the IEP is if we don't have it written into there, it's harder then to get the school district to meet those needs. So once that IEP is written, we do want to make sure that the IEP is being carried out, that our child's needs are being met as it was written. So you do get a copy of the IEP. Each of your child's teachers and service providers has access to the IEP, but they might not have read the whole thing. They might have seen maybe sort of an adaptation that was a one-pager that was provided to them with some details about your family member. So that aspect of making sure that all of the teachers have access to the IEP and understand what their role is in helping the student meet those requirements, that each of them have that. So you may have been snail mailed a copy or handed a copy of the IEP. You can get it electronically as well. You could ask for it to be emailed, and you could ask for copies to be able to give to each of the teachers, to ensure that they have a copy of the IEP and understand what the goals are, what the needs are of the student. So this IEP should lay out all the specially designed instruction, and those are called modifications. So for instance, a modification would be some students are doing math on just a I almost said mimeograph. It's really old, but just on a piece of paper, a photocopy, something like that the teacher's given. But some of the students, maybe their modification would be to have only half of those questions, or even have it in a different format and be given some instructions and using manipulatives while they do that schoolwork. And that would be part of the specially designed instruction. The other part of an IEP is called accommodations, and those are basically, I call them ramps. What is the ramp to learning? So an accommodation can be, like I talked about, that FM system. An accommodation could be sitting in the front of the classroom. An accommodation could be being able to leave the classroom for 3 minutes and take a jog around the track and then come back and immerse yourself into the classroom again. Because if we don't provide the opportunity and that accommodation for that student, are they then accessing their education? So accommodations can be unique. They can be about toileting. They may be about medication times. Let's say somebody has diabetes. And so an accommodation is being able to give them the time and the space to check their blood sugar, and maybe if they have an insulin pump, or getting a shot of insulin. If we don't give the student time and support in doing that, they're not going to be well, and they're not going to be able to participate in class and in the schooling. So the school district is responsible for the IEP. And it might not be that it's just one teacher. It could be there are other people who have a role in that. The role can be a school administrator, a principal, or somebody within the district who also makes decisions about support staff. So paraeducators, speech language pathologists, that sort of thing. So there can be other people who are involved in that as well and obligated. So here's again where I love some of the words. The IEPs, many of the IEPs that are used across Whatcom County include information on them that is specifically from the Washington state and the federal law. And I really appreciate these words that specially designed instruction is to help the student be involved and make progress in the general ed curriculum. So the progress that a student is making in their goals does need to be counted in some way or measured in some way. And you may ask to be informed about that, maybe at the end of each semester or quarter, when it's report card times. Some families will ask for monthly feedback on how a student is making progress towards a goal. Again, those goals are measured based on information we have about the student needs. So if we saw at the beginning of the school year and in the IEP that a 7th grade student is reading at a 2nd grade level, the IEP goals are going to be related to helping that student make progress, be involved, and make progress towards participating in the general ed curriculum, which may be 7th grade reading. And we want to know how things are going. We don't want to find out in June that they haven't gone well. It's great to know earlier and then be able to talk with the team and say, yeah, we're not making progress. Is there something else we can do? What else is going on? Is this, are the IEP goals being addressed by staff as well? So I really like that phrase, involved and make progress. Involved is the ramp. It's getting the kid into the classroom. If a student is overstimulated and stressed and has PTSD and keeps needing to leave the classroom, they're not involved. They're not getting that instruction and that support. If a student has some sensory needs and they are in a classroom that is chaotic and they feel uncertain and frightened and can't pay attention, we're not helping them with accommodations that they can be involved in and be learning. So that involvement can look so different for each student. So yes, after having an IEP for a year, the IEP does need to be reviewed at least once a year, and it can be done more often. But the parents and all the team members do need to get together and talk about how has the student done, where are we at in terms of reading, meeting some of those goals, and where maybe if we haven't been meeting goals, what do we see that's going on that we might be able to change? You are always welcome to make suggestions for changes, to ask for information to be added into the present levels of performance. You can agree and disagree with IEP goals. And you can ask for the team to consider information from other providers. An example would be if a student was working with, say, a psychologist or an outside therapy firm in some way, and we're working on social emotional learning, and those outside therapists have information to take back to the IEP team, we can ask the team to consider that, the information that they have of what works well and what doesn't work well. It's valid information of what's effective with this student. So when you have other things that are written down about your student, I encourage you to be able to use those too. If it's not written down, it didn't happen. So getting outside records that reflect information that you want the IEP team to have, putting those outside records in front of the IEP team can be really useful as well. And I know, for instance, when I had seen, when we had gone to see an autism specialist at one point, I had probably a 15-page document from that doctor afterwards, a pediatric neurologist. And I didn't like everything that the doctor said, but there were some select things I really wanted to highlight for the IEP team. And so I did go through there and highlight some of those pieces, added them to a note at the beginning of his document, and I sent that to the IEP team, asking them to incorporate those pieces into the IEP. So what I was doing was cherry picking what I thought was going to be useful, but it was accurate. This was real factual information from a licensed, medical provider who understood about pediatric neurology and had some ideas on what could work educationally for my student. So I was able to take that and bring that back to the team and try to use that to improve things and help the understanding of the team. And then every 3 years, a student who has an IEP does need to be reevaluated, unless you or the school system agree that reevaluation is not necessary. Part of the reason of doing the reevaluation does give us information on how that student is doing and if there are some changes. And it could be that we find out that the child does still have a disability, but is not needing specially designed instruction. So that's a piece of knowing a little bit more about what else can be evaluated for, to make sure that we're covering everything for that student. Sometimes with a student, we might only look at a narrow area and say, okay, we're only going to focus on fine motor skills because we know the student has cerebral palsy. But cerebral palsy can have other traits and things that go with it. And if we don't evaluate for some of those traits, then we won't know how to be able to meet those needs. So there could be that processing speed is something that would be helpful to know about with the student. It could be the working memory and how somebody is better at visual processing or auditory processing. Those pieces of an evaluation really tell us how to get information into a student in the best way. So one of the forms I'll refer to later shows us in these different ways what to ask the team for and some of the expectations you can have about full testing for your child. Because somebody could do an IQ test and tell you, well, your student got an 86 on the IQ test and they're fine and everything's good. But there's pieces within the IQ test that tell us more about how they process, how they remember, how they stay on task. And so even with an IQ of 86, you could have some areas of need of that student that are absolutely should be addressed by the school team. And it's helpful for you to know as a parent. I had this kind of aha moment when I'd opened the door the other day for a cat. And you know how you open a door and then a cat stands there for a while, and then they finally go out the door or come in the door? That's processing speed. And it's not good or bad. It's shorter or longer. it varies between humans and animals in so many ways. So yeah, so processing speed, if that student's not going to have the quickest answer, the quickest response, it's good for us to know, because that is not their fault. That is how their brain works. It's still processing, but not at 3 seconds. It might take 17 seconds for them to hear the instructions, think about their next steps, and then begin doing the work. So this is the piece about evaluations and reevaluations, of really being able to look further into some of the testing to understand more about your student. And it might give you some aha moments about yourself as well, to think about, oh yeah, I really don't do well when we go bowling and it's really noisy, and then my husband's trying to coach me and I do worse and worse at bowling. But if I watched somebody else bowling and then I did those same movements and I did it, it's like, oh, I'm a concrete learner. I don't quite do the auditory stuff, but I did the concrete learning. And that's fair. You're not better or worse than anybody else to be able to have that style of neurology. So yes, the IEP, the online IEP and the standard forms that are used for IEPs generally have some really clear information on them that is taken directly from the state law. And so this is also, as you're sitting in a meeting and you've been handed some papers, you might be able to look at some of the fine print across the top of a page and see that this is what the IEP is supposed to do. It is designed so that everybody's communicated to, the parents, the students, and all the teachers really know, they're clearly communicated to about the type and the amount of education, special education, and any other services or supports that are made available to the student. So that most recent evaluation or reevaluation has to be used to develop this IEP. And that's where we put down what are the unique needs of that student. If they have a long processing speed that takes some time, that should be in the present levels of performance. Because if it's not there, and we have a goal that says that the student's going to answer the teacher in 3 seconds, they're not going to be able to do that. We need to understand, again, their needs, and then how we give them the time and allow them to be included and making progress in the general ed curriculum. So what is the general education curriculum? That sometimes is a tricky thing to find out if your child is in life skills, or if they've been in early intervention services. It could be that the school district that you're working with has a developmental preschool or some other more segregated program. It is really your right as a parent to go and observe a classroom, to attend an open house night and see what other 7-year-olds are doing in the second grade classroom, or what else is happening in other places at the school. This is the piece that your child has a right to a free, appropriate public education. And a public education is what this general ed curriculum is. Most of the students, usually about 80% of the students, are able to make some progress in general ed. And some students may struggle and have some difficulty. And then that is where they would look at something called response to intervention, and not always do a focus of concern on the student, but they would think about some way to provide some supports to a student who seems to be struggling in particular areas. And the school district is doing some of these initial steps called response to intervention, or what they call multi-tiered systems of support. There's acronyms everywhere. The school districts are doing this partly because the law says that they have to do it, and partly because they can't just take every student who's having a problem and stick them in special ed. That would be illegal. It would be against people's civil rights. And the fact is there have been people who've been inappropriately placed in segregated learning environments rather than having access to the school classroom like any other student. And it's not that student's fault, it's not maybe their disability. So when we look at language learning, if a student has moved here from Ukraine and they've been living in an environment that has always spoken Ukrainian, and they come into a school in Whatcom County, they're going to be needing to learn English. And if they're not doing well at school and they're not able to keep up with things or be involved in it, it's not necessarily because they need special education services. It's because English is not their first language. So we can't just take all those students and peg them as needing special education services because that's inappropriate. And we've gotten better at not pigeonholing students. There have been some very racially motivated approaches to special education that have put brown and black kids in segregated classrooms rather than providing them with a full general education. So response to intervention is used rather than pigeonholing kids into special ed. And the school is required to work through some responses in support of that student. And then if they don't do well, if they're not still making some progress, then the school can also say, we tried X, Y, and Z as we're supposed to. And so now we need to do an evaluation and look at what else is going on for this student. It's their right to have access to the classroom and to be involved like all the rest of the students are. So, why don't I turn off record